It must be very strange to be a minister's wife. As Rita Davis, an educator and a writer who is also married to a Presbyterian minister, puts it, every 7 days I go to my husband's place of employment and literally watch him work. Weird. This unique dynamic is hardly inimitable. Sitting in the pew, I know my role is just as nuanced. Am I a church member, or supporting my husband, or assisting the nursery staff, or failing at being a single parent? I have accomplished all four before the sermon most Sundays. And of the other 19 points that Davis lists in her article, 20 Confessions of a Minister's Wife, Alison can certainly relate to most. Number 1 on Davis's list, people flip out a bit when they meet me. I watch them play back the last 5 minutes of our conversation in their head. Individuals get awkwardly nervous if they realize they used profanity, mentioned Jesus, or said they drank beer. And in that vein, here's her second point. When I curse, people are either horrified or they breathe a sigh of relief. Alison used to joke that her name badge ought to simply say Andrew's wife on it. Number 20 on Davis's list, by the way, applies here too. You can lead with her first and last name. Though in the last 3 years, of course, that's changed to Olivia's mother. I can certainly relate to that too, since in almost every situation involving our daughter, I am first and foremost Olivia's father. This is one of the things that we're trying to figure out, in fact, in terms of bringing her here to be part of our children's religious education program, because I've realized at various fellowship events when I've brought her with me that being Olivia's father takes precedence over being your minister. It's difficult to really listen to someone pouring out their heart over illness or loss when you have a 3-year-old pulling on your leg and asking if it's okay to play with the telephone and try to call grandma. Then there's the fact that while Alison is a member of this congregation, she can't be like any other member. I can't be her minister because I need to be her husband. It used to be, back in the dark ages when ministers were almost all male and gay ministers were closeted, that the minister's wife was like a free staff person. Pay for a minister and you'd also get a free RE teacher, membership coordinator, potluck organizer, chair of the flower committee, and even backup pastor. Thankfully, a lot has changed since then, with women actually in the majority in ministry and LGBT ministers embraced by their congregations. But the fact remains that a married or partnered minister cannot be their spouse's or partner's minister too. Those ways of relating to people need to be separate, and there must be a clear boundary between those roles. Of course, I have more than one role even when I clearly am someone's minister. One day I'm going to preach a sermon where I have various hats to represent the different roles I fill as a minister, putting one on, taking one off, but as yet I haven't collected a sufficient number of hats. Suppose, though, that someone comes to me with a problem they need to discuss. My initial role is pastoral. I need to show them compassion, sympathy, and understanding, and that's true whether they're telling me something that I think is right or wrong, whether I agree with them or not. But chances are they're telling me about this problem because they want me to fix it. Well, since my magic wand still hasn't made it back from the repair shop, what other roles are available to me? Perhaps I need to be a counselor, helping this person work with others to resolve the problem. Perhaps I need to be an administrator, working with staff and committees to change processes and procedures. Perhaps I need to be a teacher, providing information to the person who came to me that might help them solve their problem. Perhaps I need to be a prophet, calling for larger structural changes in the name of justice. But then, sometimes, and running through all those other options, all I can be is pastoral. And that's because right from the start, one big boundary issue is confidentiality. Unless someone tells me otherwise, or unless it's already public knowledge, I hold what they tell me in confidence. So that means that if someone does come to me with a problem they want me to fix, particularly if that problem is with another person, then there are certain questions that I have to ask. The first is, have you spoken to the other person about this? If they have, or if they haven't but are willing to do so, maybe I can step into the teaching role and help them with ways to talk to the other person. Otherwise, we move to my second question, which is, can I go with you to talk to the other person? If they're willing, then I can step into the counselling role. But if not, then the third and final question is, can I share what you have told me, including your name, with the board or the committee on ministry or whoever would be appropriate? And if they're willing to let me do that, then I can step into an administrative or even prophetic role. But if not, then the only option to me that does not violate the boundary of confidentiality is to continue in the pastoral role. Let me give you one more example of roles and boundaries. I once wrote to a colleague with a request to be part of an event. It was a request about a specific event already on the calendar, so there was a deadline. And it was an event that I was pretty excited about, so I was disappointed that after writing and then writing again, I still hadn't heard back. Then I had a thought. I'd actually met the colleague's spouse before, and they'd said nice things about something I'd said, and we talked a bit more after that. So, and even though some time had passed, I thought it would be okay to write to them and ask if they would pass on my request to their spouse. Well, that did not go as planned. They were angry and did not hold back from letting me know how angry they were. And though it would have been easy to get defensive and respond in kind, I did realize what I had done, and I apologized. I'd assumed a level of familiarity between us and thoroughly disrespected the boundaries between all three of us. And though I apologized, it wasn't enough to repair the damage to the relationship that I'd started to establish with both colleague and spouse. As Ben Franklin put it in his Poor Richard's Almanac, love your neighbour, yet don't pull down your hedge. Clear boundaries are important when it comes to healthy relationships. Or, in the new wording of the proverb as coined by Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbours. Of course, Frost is questioning that piece of wisdom, and there's nothing wrong with questioning because it's what distinguishes wisdom from dogma. He admits to a certain amount of mischief, of course. The something there is that doesn't love a wall, after all, is the moisture that gets in between the stones and in freezing pushes them apart. And frozen moisture is better known as, wait for it, frost. But it's not an unreasonable question to ask why you need a wall when on one side are apple trees and on the other side are pine trees, neither of which, unlike cows, have ever been known to wander. What's more, Frost expresses concern about building walls that shut someone out or close someone in, and he worries about the problems that that might cause. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I had a hard time finding an appropriate hymn to follow Mending Wall as my reading this morning. Our hymn book contains lots about unity and joining together and connectedness and being one, and that's a vitally important message in such a culture as ours, with its excessive emphasis on individualism. But the problem with individualism, the reason why community is the antidote, is really the selfishness that is promoted as individualism. It's the I can do whatever I want and nobody can tell me otherwise mentality that's the problem. Rather than selfishness, though, what we need is self-awareness. After all, community doesn't take individuals and blur them together until there are no differences. For all that we like to use imagery such as tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea. No, community requires self-differentiated individuals, people who know how to be in relationship with one another without losing their own sense of identity or their ability to be authentic to themselves. Otherwise, that's not relationship, that's codependence. So the middle hymn I finally chose, John Coleman Adams' Our Praise We Give, does at least address the idea of differentiation. The soil in the fields, the labourers who work those fields, and the resulting harvest are related to one another, but they're distinct. The open sea, the boat that travels across it, and the safe harbour it finally reaches, those two are related to one another, but they are distinct. The long dusty road, the pilgrims on their paths, and the welcoming in at journey's end, those once more are related to one another, but they are all distinct too. In each case, the three things are in relationship with one another, but if any one of the three wasn't there, there wouldn't be any relationship either. It's the fact that they're distinct from one another that makes the relationship work. And that's the source of another irony that Frost weaves into his poem. After all, even as he questions the inherited nugget of wisdom that his neighbour offers, there they are, working together, side by side, to repair the wall. It's the wall, in fact, that brings them together as neighbours. Working together toward a common goal in that way requires them to spend time together, getting to know one another better. Without the wall, they might not be neighbours so much as acquaintances who just happen to live next door. The paradox is that even as they are literally building a wall between themselves, they are becoming better neighbours. So it's not just a vague correlation between good fences and good neighbours. It's that the good fences do actually make good neighbours. What's more, the question must be asked, what is the opposite of a good fence? It's not having no fence. That's just a lack of a fence. No, the opposite of a good fence is a bad fence. A good fence is where both neighbours share responsibility for the boundary and it protects their equality. A bad fence, on the other hand, might be more of a burden to one neighbour than the other, or might protect one neighbour more than the other. A good fence represents mutual respect and agreement, whereas a bad fence represents inequality and exploitation. Now, we can come up with contrived examples of bad fences in a literal sense. Imagine, for instance, two neighbours who raise chickens. There is, of course, a fence between them. But one of the neighbours has secretly built into the fence hidden trapdoors that allow the other neighbour's chickens to pass through while preventing any of the birds from going the other way. Well, pretty soon the second neighbour begins to wonder what's happening to their flock. And if they notice that the first neighbour's yard is starting to get crowded, well, that might lead to accusations and malice and lawsuits. Bad fences make bad neighbours. But if we're talking about bad fences in a metaphorical sense, well, we don't have to invent any examples at all. How about the fact that on average women earn only 82 cents for every dollar that their male colleagues earn? Did you know that there are actually more men named David who are CEOs of S&P 1500 companies than there are women who are CEOs of those companies? Consider race as a factor, and the disparities get worse. Black men earn only 75 cents compared to the dollar earned by white men. For black women, it's only 64 cents. For Hispanic individuals, those numbers are even lower. And of course, African Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, but that's assuming they get to trial, given that African Americans are also 4 times more likely to be killed by police officers. And for young black men, it's not just 4 times, it's 21 times more likely. So if the fences are made up, in this case, of the laws and other social structures supposedly intended to guarantee every person's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, they turn out to be really bad fences because those rights are far from being applied equally. So how do we share responsibility for our interpersonal boundaries such that they support and protect our equality? How do we ensure that our boundaries represent mutual respect and equitable relationships with our neighbours? Maybe if we can figure out how that works between individual people, then we can also figure out how it works for groups of people. In her essay on everyday relationships as spiritual practices, Unitarian Universalist minister Jane Ellen Malden comes up with 4 elements to consider. The first that she lists is awareness. It's easy to go through life dashing from one task to another, and any spiritual practice disrupts that headlong tumble by bringing intentionality and mindfulness to what we're doing. So Malden recommends cultivating a deeper awareness of the people around us, the people we love, the people we care about, the people in our lives in all manner of ways, and ourselves, of course. Awareness of ourselves is an absolutely essential part of becoming a self-differentiated individual, recognizing the boundaries that define who we are. Then there's appreciation of the present moment. Malden recalls being in a doctor's office, a television blaring at one end, a radio just as loud at the other, her children alternately getting into everything and coughing in her face, and her primary task, other than occasionally wiping a runny nose, was simply to wait. It can be really hard to appreciate the present moment under such circumstances, but of course she points out something that we all know to be true. The present moment is very precious because it is truly the only reality we have. If we can find that appreciation in the midst of noise and chaos, we can find it anywhere. Third is what Malden calls detachment from attachment. And when it comes to personal boundaries and healthy relationships, at the top of the list of attachments from which we need to detach are our ideas of what we want other people to be. Where are the places in our lives, for instance, where we get disappointed and even upset with other people because it turns out that we expected them to live up to our ideals? I know it's a growing edge for me when I'm frustrated with someone and then I realize it's because I expected them to do something in just the same way that I would have done it myself. And what's worse, I never actually told them what I was expecting. Rather, Malden explains, our only goal should be compassion, without expectation or attachment, something that is otherwise known as unconditional love. Last, but in some ways first on Malden's list, is commitment. Every spiritual practice runs into difficulties and problems from time to time, and we won't go through them and deepen our self-awareness unless we make the commitment to keep going. It's commitment, after all, that creates ongoing, regular opportunities to practice awareness, to practice appreciation of the present moment, and to practice detaching from attachment. And that's what makes the difference between a spiritual practice and a hobby. The good news, as Malden concludes her essay, is that everyday relationships as a spiritual practice is available to every one of us, wherever and with whomever we find ourselves. Now, as you think about this in your everyday lives, and if mending an old stone wall isn't something you get to do very often, let me offer another way to think about it. Plus, I like to segue into our closing hymn. In her book, Gift from the Sea, Anne Morrow Lindbergh compares a good relationship to a dance, noting that it is even built on some of the same rules. For one thing, the dance partners shouldn't cling to one another. To touch heavily, she explains, would be to arrest the pattern and freeze the movement, to check the endlessly changing beauty of the unfolding of the dance. Rather, as the dance develops, each dancer moves within it as a distinct individual, each aware of the other, and perhaps more importantly, self-aware. And that's because, Morrow concludes, they know they are partners moving to the same rhythm, creating a pattern together and being invisibly nourished by it. So as we remain mindful of the ways that good boundaries and healthy relationships are intimately connected, all of us weaving together the pattern of this journey of the spirit that we call life, let it be a dance.